Good afternoon. My name is Jim Conlan, and welcome to the latest edition of our classic series, Icons of Sports Entertainment. So far, we're speaking to people who have left their mark in the sports entertainment industry over the last 30 or 40 years. We've spoken to the likes of Jeff Jarrett, Devin Hughes, Rob Van Dam, Mark Henry, to name but a few. And tonight, we're delighted to be joined by a true legend. It's fair to say he has had 48 title reigns in his career. He's appeared in all the major industries from ECW to WCW to TNA to WWF. He's the one and only Scott Levy. You might know him by familiarizing him by his name Raven. A classic icon wrestler from one of the original ECW stars from the ECW era, a hardcore wrestling legend, what they deem Raven to be. But Scott, I want to begin by asking you, in terms of growing up back in the early 80s, was wrestling an interest of yours from a young age? Were you all into that Andre the Giant, Hulk Hogan sort of era, or were you very much into other sort of sports like basketball or football, or were you a very sort of athletic sporting boy as you growing up, or how did wrestling come to the attention of Scott Levy?
Um, all right. So first of all, I grew up in the 70s, not the 80s.
70s, yeah,
Yeah,
perfect.
I'm 56.
70s.
Um, the yeah, I was a big wrestling fan as a kid. Um, and I grew up, I was born in Philadelphia, so I watched WWWF. I don't know how many, they had more W's in the name back then.
Yeah.
And I think it was WWWF. And so I watched that because what people don't realize now is that back in the day in the States, you could only watch the wrestling that was in your area.
Okay.
Yeah, like it's like TV wasn't national then. There was no national channels, so you got the local wrestling, which, if you lived in the Northeast, it was WWWF. If you lived in Florida, it was Florida Championship Wrestling. If you lived in Texas, Texas is so big, they had a couple different wrestling organizations. They had Watts's. I mean, not Watts. They had the Von Erichs. They had Joe Blanchard's. There was an organization in Los Angeles, one in Puerto Rico, one in Kansas City, one in Portland and Washington. I mean, so there's a lot of places, so all you knew was what happened in your local, in your area. So I grew up till I was about 9 or 10 in Philadelphia, and I watched WWF. And but then we moved to Florida when I was like, well, actually, no, we moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where the AWA was. And so I was totally exposed to a whole new wrestling there. Then we moved to Florida a year later, a whole new wrestling, it was crazy. Like, you're like, holy crap, I had no idea. You had no idea. I mean, unless you read the wrestling magazines, the Mark books, which would talk about wrestlers in other territories that you would like one day hope to see, because, most people stayed in their territories or traveled a couple different territories, but, you always hoped you could see the big stars kind of stayed in their own location, they homesteaded.
Okay.
And it was weird. Like when I lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for a year, which is up north where it's really cold in the middle, right in the middle of the country, but up at the top. They had Dusty Rhodes was there as a bad guy. And then I moved to Florida a year later, and he was the top baby face in the territory. I was like, so it's like I moved to this town, West Palm Beach, and I lived like 2/3 of a mile from the West Palm Beach Auditorium.
Yeah.
And so all the local kids and wrestling was there every Monday night at the West Palm Beach Auditorium. So all the local kids in the apartment complex we lived at, they would go to the matches. They would walk there. I was like, this is great. I can walk to wrestling every Monday night. But all they wanted to talk about was Dusty Rhodes. And like, to me, Dusty Rhodes was a bad guy because, when I was 9 and in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, he was a bad guy. So I didn't know he was a good guy, right? And then like literally like after 1 or 2 matches watching him, I was like, oh my God, he's the greatest. Like I went from like the biggest anti-Dusty because he was a heel to the biggest baby face, the biggest mark of him, and it was so cool growing up in West Palm Beach where I lived, because every Monday night we would walk to the wrestling matches. It was so close. and tickets were like $3 a week, $3 a general admission. This is like 1975, 76 maybe. And but it was funny, like when the world champion was there, because the world champion would come sometimes, he would do a
Yeah.
loop of Florida. So you get to see the world champion. And I forget if it was Terry Funk or it was Dory or who it was, but they would raise the ticket prices 50 cents, make them 50 cents higher. They said championship prices do apply. I always thought that was hilarious.
And Scott, a very intellectual man, a degree in criminal justice from Delaware. Obviously, having a degree in criminal justice, you would think that would open up possibilities of being a solicitor, a lawyer, a barrister. In terms of that, how did you sort of say to yourself, right, wrestling is the dream that I want to pursue? Obviously, you have a highly intellectual degree behind you, and I suppose your probably parents and loved ones are saying, look, Scott, go down this sort of route, go down the solicitor barrister sort of route. What made you tip over the edge to say, right, I'm going to be a wrestler even though I have such qualifications like this?
I didn't want to be 50 years old looking back and going, man, I should have done that. So I figured as long as I attempt it, I'm a success. The only failure is the guy that doesn't try. So I figured, and my parents were like, they're like, as long as it makes you happy, you have a degree to fall back on. So, we're not really too worried about it. It's not what we want for you, but if it makes you happy, go try it. And if it doesn't work out, then you use your degree. So it was
And
pretty cool.
in terms of those early days, Scott, in terms of training under Larry Sharp in the Monster Factory in New Jersey, how did that come about for you in terms of finding Larry Sharp? And was it a sort of, let's say, someone knows someone who knows someone sort of link that maybe brought it to your attention? Or
No, I had no idea where to go to wrestling school, but I heard about Malenko's school, but I couldn't find any information on it. So that's why I didn't go there. Um, and the reason I went to Larry Sharp's Monster Factory is back then before Larry Sharp's Monster Factory, there was only like one or two other wrestling schools in the country, Malenko's and Tony Altamari had a school, or Killer Kowalski, I think. But they were the schools had just started opening up for wrestling. Prior to that, you had to know somebody. You had to know a wrestler, or a wrestler had to say, "Hey, you'd be good for the business," and he would give you a shot, and they would, bring you to the arenas before the show and train you before the matches. And I was lucky that people started realizing that there's a niche for wrestling school. So Larry Sharp had opened one, and he had got an article in Sports Illustrated. So I was like, well, this seems like he's got some connections. Obviously, if he's in Sports Illustrated, which scoffs at pro wrestling, or at least it used to, not anymore, but they used to. So I figured, all right, I'll try that, and I went there, and he was always gone. He was in Japan the whole time when I was with Bam Bam, managing Bam Bam Bigelow. So he didn't train me. A guy named Charlie Fulton trained me. He was a really good hand, really good worker, but not charismatic, really.
And Scott, in terms of your early stint in the WWF, coming about your sort of debut sort of experience in terms of that, was that sort of a learning curve for you, those sort of early years within the sort of wrestling sort of industry, maybe your earlier time in WCW, your earlier time in WWF? Did you feel it was more learning the ropes in terms of the industry?
No, I wrestled in the territories for a couple of years before I went to WWE and WCW. I started out in Memphis working for Lawler and Jerry Jarrett, and then I moved to Florida. I worked there for 3-4 months. Then I moved to Florida and wrestled there for 10 months, Florida Championship Wrestling. Then I moved to Vancouver for a month for Al Tomko, and then I spent 2 years in Portland learning the road, like really how to wrestle. That's why I was really good at such a young age, because I spent 2 years working 7 nights a week, working 15, 20 minutes a night, every night of the week, literally. I mean, we averaged over 300 nights a year in Portland. I mean, that's not an exaggeration or an embellishment. We literally, we only worked less than 6 nights a week, maybe a few weeks of the year, and we made that up by working 7 nights a week sometimes. but the average was 6 nights a week, you know.
Oh,
So for 2 years, I mean, you learn how to work, you learn how to listen to crowds. Like a crowd can be cheering, but it can mean something totally different than what you think. Like just because they're cheering doesn't mean it can mean they're ecstatic. It can mean they're being polite. It can mean that they're cheering, but they're like, all right, move on, next act. But you know, we're gonna be polite. It can mean that they're into it, but they're not that into it. You know, it's like you have to tell. There's degrees of the applause, boos, cheers, everything, and you have to be. And you, unless you work like territories, like small territories, you'll never really learn what crowd noise means. Like I remember one time, like Canyon and I were working, and he was like, and it was after the match, and we were doing some post match nonsense, and he's like, let's keep doing this. Let's keep going. Let's go a little longer. I go, no. I go, to people, they've had enough. They just being polite. He goes, no, they're cheering. I go, it's you're not hearing what they're really saying, because he had never spent time. He hadn't spent 2 years in the territory listening to, you know, when your average is a couple hundred people, you know, a night, and then in Portland, every Saturday was TV, and that would get a couple thousand people. But then the rest of the shows, the other 5 nights a week, 6 nights a week, you'd get a couple hundred people, you know, so you had to listen. And so, but, you know, that's like an indie show, but but instead of doing it just on the weekends, you're doing it every single night, and you're listening, and you start to realize that crowd cheering can mean so many. It's like the word the island of Hawaii has a word called aloha,
yeah.
and it has 17 different meanings. It's
Okay.
like, that's crazy. You know, it means hello, it means goodbye, but it's all in the context. Like if you're leaving and you say aloha, obviously it means goodbye. If you're saying hello, it means hello, but it's the same word. It's the same thing with cheering of the crowd, and hearing that and knowing what they're really saying. You know, like I could tell sometimes, like Canyon would want to milk it. I'm like, you're killing it. You're actually working against us, because the people are going along with it, but they would rather we get off the stage and they get to the next match. But he's not hearing that subtlety.
Hmm.
But you know, I mean, I was very lucky. I'm like the last guy to spend time in the territories to make it big. You know, after me, pretty much that was the end of the territories. You know, there were no more territories when I basically ran them into the ground and killed them. No, the no, it's like by the time I got into WCW after leaving Portland and going to Global Wrestling, I think
Yeah.
uh, the territories had died. Like the only ones that were left were like Kansas City and Continental and Memphis and Texas, and then they started dying off, and then there was just, and you know, you need places. That's why I feel so bad for today's, you know, up and comers. They have, you know, I was lucky. I got to work 6 nights a week. It's something I love doing and get paid well to do it. You know, I mean, nowadays you got, you know, a lot of guys have to work for free just to get an education, which, hey, it's worth it if you're gonna, you know, if you have aspirations to be a star, sometimes you got to do that. You got to, you know, you got to lose money to make money. Like I remember my first couple of matches. I think we had to drive to Maine for a match, and that's like a 9-hour drive, you know, and I totally lost money, you know, between a hotel and what, you know, I got paid, you know, back then the minimum you got paid was $50.
Oh,
Like
wow.
you never got paid
Wow.
less than $50. That was the minimum. And then it creeped down to 40, and then it eventually down to 25, and then to some guys having to pay to work, you know. But back in the territory days, you never made less than $50 a night. So if you work 6 nights a week, that's $300. But in Portland, you'd work. So you worked the 5 nights on the road, and then the one night in Portland, which was a couple thousand people. So you'd make $300 for that. So you'd make 300 plus 250. That's 550 I was making, and that was 1989. So I was
That's
making
a lot of money.
550 a week plus picture money. Even though I was a heel, I still sold a ton of gimmicks, because you know, as a guy, I used to be a good-looking guy, believe it or not, but not anymore. But so I was making 550 a week plus pictures, which in 1989, that was great. That'd be like making $1,000 a week now, you know, for doing nothing, for doing something I loved. I mean, I couldn't believe my luck, you know, to be able to be in this, you know, and to learn and to have people to learn from, you know, who would, and that's another cool thing, because you in the car ride after the match, you would talk about your match, and you ride with a veteran. I used to ride with the booker, and he would, and I would go, okay, what'd you think? Like he'd either could go, oh man, you shouldn't have done this, and I go like, why? He's like, well, this is how he taught me. He would go, figure it out. Like the guy named the Grappler. He was the booker, and he worked on top for Watts when he was like 19, which is unbelievable because he was like 5'10", and Watts loved big guys, but he's only like 5'10" and 240 pounds, which was tiny for Watts's territory. So imagine how good he must have been at 19 to be working on top. So, but the way he taught me, and he taught me how to book too, because like he wouldn't just give me answers. He would say, like one day I go to him, I said, we're driving to some town, and I go, hey, I want to be in a cage match, because I don't know, I want to be in a cage match. I thought that'd be pretty cool, Like I always pictured the sitting on top of the cage facing my opponent. You're both sitting there and have a slugfest, and you keep, until one guy falls off the cage.
Yeah.
And he goes, all right, because what are you going to do the week after? I go, I don't know. He goes, figure it out. So I've come back. So, I think about it. And after a few days, I come to him, I go, next in a car ride, I go, hey, what if we did this afterwards? He goes, all right, what are you going to do the week after that? I go, I don't know. And he made me think. Then he made me think what I would do the weeks to build up to it and the weeks after it. And he taught me how to think linearly and episodically for television, which is why I loved like Florida Championship Wrestling, and stuff like that, as opposed to WWF, because WWF, like back then, it was all squash matches, TV. Yeah. It was always because the whole idea was you have big names fight nobodies, beat them, and then when you see the two big names fight each other, you don't know who's going to win, and that's, you have to pay money to see the two big names fight. And so they rarely ever shot angles on WWF TV. But in Florida Championship Wrestling, every week they would shoot angles, and like what happened this week would have consequences for the next week, and then and then there'd be consequences for the week after that. So it was so much more dramatic, and that's the wrestling I loved. Like I didn't care, like as a sport, I could, I was like, okay, it's cool sport, but I loved it for the drama, for the soap opera, for the fact that if Joe Schmo attacks some other guy, week one, so week two, the guy's looking for revenge, but he can't find it, and maybe week three, the guy goes for the revenge, but it backfires because another guy joins in, and then something else happens, and then the next week, and then finally they're gonna have a match, but then something else happens, and you're like, oh, and it's a soap opera, it's really what it is, and when it's done right, and then and that's why I never went to Japan for any length of time, because it's not very soap operatic there. It's more of they treated it more as an athletic contest, whereas in the States it was treated more as a drama, so to speak.
And Scott, in terms of finding that iconic persona and iconic character as such, we all know for different wrestlers it takes time to land on that sort of persona. We know, for example, Steve Austin, before he became Stone Cold, he had the Ringmaster, and then he was Stunning Steve, and all of a sudden he landed on that Stone Cold Steve Austin character. For you, there was Scotty Flamingo, there was Scott the Body, Matt Man, Scott Anthony.
I was never Matt Man. That's a somebody needs to correct Wikipedia. I was never Matt Man.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, correct Wikipedia, somebody.
Yes, no problem. We'll make note of that there. Scott, but the character for you that came about, that you hit ECW 1995, the character Raven. It said that it was inspired by a poem. Is that a true story?
No. It was inspired by I wanted to appeal to the disenfranchised, and inside, like, on the outside I'm very jovial, but on the inside, I'm like the clown crying on the inside, and or I was. And so I wanted to do something that would I felt like if I created a character that was based on myself, I would be better at playing it, and Scotty the Body and all those characters. That was my public persona in real life, magnified by 10. But the Raven was my internal personality magnified by 100, or magnified by 10, I guess, depending on how. But the depths I took it to, are much deeper than I would in real life, obviously. But that's, it's like a tortured poetic soul, a martyr for society's dysfunction. Um, all these things I felt, were all parts of my personality that I needed to explore, and I just put it together, and the reason I came up with the name Raven and a quote the Raven Nevermore catchphrase is had nothing to do with the poem the Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. It had to do with I was trying to think of a cool name, and I was watching the movie The Crow, and I saw and the guy, what's the guy's name in The Crow? I go, his real name's Eric Draven, is the character's name. I go, Draven, Raven, quote the Raven Nevermore. Now I got a name and a catchphrase. Now it was that simple. I mean, it literally came to me in 5 seconds as like some sort of inspiration,
Yeah.
just like you just get inspiration someday, and that's how fast I put together the outfit in like 5 minutes. In the same 10-minute period, I put together the name, the catchphrase, the outfit, everything, and it all just fell into place.
So many people I've spoken to, Scott, credit Paul Heyman in ECW in terms of the impact that he had on their career, in terms of his mind and his vision for the wrestling business, in terms of the sense of direction he led actors and wrestlers on the path to much greater and bigger things. Did you start to share that same similar experience for your time working with Paul Heyman?
Yeah, I think the best work I ever did was with Paulie. Um, he's brilliant. He considers himself like to be like a head coach in the sense that he gets the best, and he's great at getting the best out of each performer. Like, everybody needs to be coached differently, and that's the thing in this business is it's not like that in most places. But Paulie was more like a coach than the owner slash booker.
Mm.
So he would coach you, and he would talk to me one way, talk to Dreamer another way, talk to Shane Douglas another way. He knew how to motivate people. He knew how to motivate us, in each in its own unique fashion, and that's why part of the reason he was so good, and he was creative as hell.
Mm. And Scott, in terms of those sort of matches which we saw in ECW, and you're involved in some of those real classic hardcore matches, for you, in terms of the choreography, in terms of the script, in terms of putting that match together and everything that goes with it, in terms of the after effects, did it really take? Were you running so much on adrenaline, or did maybe the week after, did you really feel the effects on the body in terms of some of those gripping and mouth-watering matches that you had in the time, because they really pushed the boundaries, and did it really take an awful lot out of you in terms of recovery as well?
No, no, I mean, you get used to it. Your body gets used to getting beat up. I mean, I had wear and tear. I have a ton of wear and tear, and I'm paying for it now. But you know, the at the time, no, you're just it's what you do for a living. So you have to know you're gonna have a little bit of pain, and a little bit of discomfort, and a little bit of you know a little bit of everything and that's just the way it is. You just live with it.
Mm. And in terms of working with equipment, and in terms of working with those sort of equipment and pieces that come with some of those hardcore matches, are you really putting all your trust and faith in your fellow professional in terms of his ability to perform those actions? Obviously, you're giving up your
Yeah, it's the same.
body.
It's the same. It's the same as a regular match. It's just using props instead.
Mm.
You're just using chairs instead of punches. You have to trust your opponent not to punch your lights out. Because you're giving them your body. It's the same thing with a garbage can or a garbage can lid or whatever. You know.
Mm. And in terms of ECW, it set a boundary in terms of some of those matches. But when you see some of the ultra violent things now, like CZW and the Combat Zone Wrestling, and in terms of that sort of severe wrestling, do you feel that's more puts off in terms of the showpiece of wrestling, in terms of maybe that's going a bit too far?
Look, if people want to pay to see it, that's up to them. Everything. You know. Um, a lot sometimes it goes too far for my taste, but so also sometimes it goes too far the other way for my taste, too slow. I mean, everybody, whatever, if it's going to draw money, then it's fair business, it's fair play.
Mm.
um How are we on time? Because I got to take my dog to the vet in a little while.
No problem. We've 2 more minutes to go, Scott. Scott, in terms of your time in the WWE, in terms of that whole evasion storyline, was that probably one of the highlights for you in terms of your time in
No, it was
WWE?
one of the lowest points of my career,
Okay,
actually,
okay,
because they didn't use us. The invasion, all they did was they didn't push any of us, and basically we just were lumps of clay just to get run over and not even be. We didn't get promos. We didn't get anything, you know. So no, it was a horrible time. It
okay.
really made me question, you know, being in this business. It was so miserable.
Okay. And Scott, in terms of lastly, in terms of the wrestling industry being involved in it, if you to do it all over again, Scott Levy, would as a young buck starting out again, in terms of the memories, in terms of the lifestyle you've experienced, in terms of that Raven character, would you go on that journey one more time?
Of course, absolutely.
Uh, Scott Levy, an absolute pleasure talking to you for our special documentary, Icons of Sports Entertainment. An absolute pleasure talking about your memories in the industry, the character playing Raven, your time in ECW, WCW, TNA, and the WWF. And no doubt you've left a true mark on the industry, a real Hall of Famer to note as well, Scott. We wish you and all your family and your loved ones all the best. And in this future, in terms of the uncertain times we have. And God bless, take care. And Scott Levy, thanks again.
Thank you. Hey, we're off the air now, right? I thought you